These are some of my thoughts around decolonizing the curriculum in higher education. In this talk, I'll highlight my cautions and frustrations, and I guess it's to suggest that vigilance is really important for how movements with radical intent are easily co-opted, particularly within the university. That this doesn't become another thing our institutions can use for their branding or image, or even us for our tick boxing or career advancement. There would be a terrible irony to that. So in this talk, I'll speak from my experience and share. And this is in no way to suggest that I'm not in support of those who are trying to do this work. I'm really strongly supportive of the attempts to build critical consciousness in our staff and in our students, and to have the institution consider its place in the world and its role in erasures and violences, and also for your and my interest and concerns about our subjects, about our own role, about our students. I've started this discussion with an image that I took in 2018 of a site-specific artwork. There's a recreated shadow in it, a shadow that may have been cast from the statue of Cecil John Rhodes on its plinth, and you can see the plinth on the left. This event may be known to you. It was the removal of that statue by South African students that struck a chord with movements across the world and has been distilled in time as emblematic of the decolonizing the curriculum trend in our times. The event was part of larger issues important for my country of South Africa, and I'm a product of that country. Many of the concerns that contributed to that scale of discontent. And so I guess I'm beginning in that shadow for my contribution to make some sort of sense in this discussion. I just want to reiterate, I'm not a scholar in this area, though in many ways as a practitioner I've tried to grapple with the overall project of emancipation and consciousness and erasure in my work in the last 20 years. It hasn't always had this name, and so I've avoided claims of expertise or authority in this area. Once I've contextualized a bit about my understanding, personally as an academic citizen and a scholar in critical higher education studies, I'll then discuss what might be meant by decolonizing the curriculum at Queen's, and ways perhaps of thinking through the different levels of the curriculum, and in discussion with texts by other intellectuals from across the world. I do that to sort of make sense of it for myself and hopefully for you. I've added hyperlinks for you to follow. I was in South African higher education studies, particularly in the subfield of academic development. And I think over time there was a certain amount of blinkeredness coming from a post-conflict, post-colonial, post-apartheid society, that in our desire for transformation, there was a desire for that perhaps over the justice of reckoning, and too easy shifts or complacency brought on by economic growth and a sense of peace and reconciliation, over and above the discomfort of addressing our Afrophobia, our systems of colonial relations, and other sort of blinkeredness on a systemic and an individual level. And after the 2 decades of institutional transformation of universities, from vice-chancellors to the demographics of staff and students, and much initiatives around diversity and inclusion, and indeed in terms of teaching and learning equity work as well, student protests arose, and I think rightly so. Suddenly, after that, after the might of students, the decolonizing rhetoric arose as a sort of currency in the universities. And it became, I think, reduced to teaching and learning only, to issues of diversifying reading lists, educating about white privilege, backpacks of privilege, that sort of thing. And also a sort of emergence of a performance of humility around positioning at the expense of energies being pushed towards structural change and material change. Now, you'll find decolonization on many websites in the country and different initiatives occurring at various levels, some really amazing. And the idea of decolonizing the curriculum has also struck a chord here in the UK, particularly in England, the sort of seat of the empire. But you have to ask yourself, when something becomes such a dominant discourse, what is being drowned out? There's a really interesting text by Chepo Matlingozi, who talks about decolonization, and he refers to Mampele. I'd like to just talk about this briefly. Mampele advanced an argument that the aims of the political transition in South Africa and in other parts of Africa ought to be about thinking about what is a sort of conducive environment to reassert African humanness and African becoming. And what he observed is, in the use of our language and thinking around non-racialism and the sort of hastiness around in the reconciliation project, it constrained the conditions for that environment. And he also warned about the negotiations that happened in our constitution between black and white elites, that it would result in a sort of transition from very clear legal structures of sort of white domination to white hegemony. And I think that issue of hegemony becomes really important when we're thinking around this. And so today, when you have an assertion, and particularly at the time it was an assertion around the student protest, but it hasn't ended really. The assertion comes from that sort of the majority that hasn't been assimilated into these new ways of thinking and these new layers of privilege, and they assert their demands from the underside of society with considerable force, and they make the limits of the transition known. It's interesting, I'm recording this during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the limits of the transition around economics particularly and economic justice is just so evident now. It becomes, when these sort of crises emerge, becomes really evident as to who benefits from these processes. So Mampele anticipated that a decolonial project that was focused on whiteness or on repeating colonial ideas of Africanness and blackness can't enable a genuine return to the source of what is Africa. So for me, decolonizing might be a different thing to you, right? I also think that decolonizing is something that is actually all-encompassing. It's not only within the university. But if you're considering the university, within the university, it has to operate on a number of levels, and also a critical awareness of the complexity of the university ecology and its histories. It has to require a consideration of context, of course, and so some of what I say you may think is not applicable here, or is. Arguably, some of what is applicable in England may not be applicable in quite the same ways in Northern Ireland. So there needs to be a consideration of context and a connection between the boundaries of the individual, one's role, the classroom, the department, the discipline, the institution, etc. Another concern that I have is the way that we see the discourse of decolonizing the curriculum taken up here in the UK. I'm not the only one concerned about this, of course, especially when one gets invited to workshops or to help with special issues of journals or whatever, and there's simply no genuine concern with grappling with the colonial in decolonizing. I've actually started to say, why are you inviting me to be part of this? I mean, there's always the question, why do you invite me as a white African? But why invite me to be part of this and to make me do this work, this labor, if there's no other African in the conversation, or the issue of the continent or the colonial project in the continent or empire, if there's no reckoning with that within the discussion. So I guess it's quite clear that I'm maybe very much for decolonizing the university, but I worry about the appropriation of the discourse and the associations that it has here. There seems to be an easy way of associating it with existing concerns and projects, and ridding it of its radical possibilities. And I'll discuss this in relation to good work, good texts on the subject in this talk. Some of the concerns I have is the sort of ready collapse of the project of decolonization into diversity speak, which is problematic anyway on many levels, as it's very, very rarely structural in focus. Also, the easy appropriation into what is good for internationalization. And there's a concern that that is not necessarily about transforming the curriculum, and very much linked with the neoliberal and neocolonial processes of capitalism in the academy. But then there's also a linking around minorities and BAME students, very rarely staff or their knowledges or belief systems. And so it becomes quite easily about the accommodation of others. A soft accommodationist approach that is not about democratizing the university, nor its internal dynamics, processes or purposes, nor its external relations to its publics or the nation or the world, but about making us feel better about what we're not doing and being. So, with that, I'll begin with my concerns, if you would still like to stay with me, and let me unpack a little of my own understanding of decolonization. What I hope to make clear by this discussion and the images is that the conditions for making manifest decolonization is very different in South Africa, and I'm very much influenced by that. But I'm not just saying that to explain my own influence. I'm talking about the conditions for engaging with the project of decolonization. To a certain extent, the disruption of academics' norms and traditions and assumptions and practices is sanctioned in that space at quite a top level, albeit that it's still very different. This, of course, raises a myriad of tensions and conflicts in interest. It's part of a very long struggle for emancipation that extends well beyond the university. So we might want to ask questions about the conditions for this here, how to avoid it being a diminished sort of plug-in or tick box. Tuck and Yang put it beautifully in this piece. The danger is of decolonization becoming a metaphor and it being operationalized for other purposes. One of the easy conflations is decolonization with diversity. In a way, this serves benevolent goals and fits easily with other agendas that the university benefits from and would like us to be aligned with. Have a good look at Makubela's paper. There have been many critiques of the constraints to radical diversity work in universities across the world. What Makubela allows us is access to an analysis that, in his words, reveals the underside of diversity's official claims to equality and justice, pointing to what he described as the terrors and ironies of this liberal ideology, and its refusal to recognize that whiteness as a system and justice can never coexist or inhabit in the same space. However, there are others to whom the twinning of the concepts is valid and who use the currency of diversity for the purposes of decolonization. I've included two of the greats of decolonial thought here in these references, Gloria Wecker and Rolando Vasquez, who I'll discuss in a bit more detail later. They worked together on this project for a university in Amsterdam. Rolando is the co-director with Walter Mignolo on the Decolonial Summer School in Middelburg of the Netherlands. So in this talk I'll offer some notions on what I think decolonization of the curriculum is about. But before that, I think it's important that you know I situate my understandings of what is meant by the curriculum within curriculum theory and the marginal critical traditions of adult education and critical constructivism. So you'll see it extends far beyond the micro-curriculum of teaching and learning, even though that is very important. It requires larger engagements and considerations, which will explain on why I touch on these issues in what I'm about to say. I don't necessarily agree with or adopt the arguments of those I'm presenting here, but I think they pose very important questions of the different levels of what the curriculum is. While some might be tempted to assert that colonialism ended in most places with a break in the dominance of empire with its colonies, if we go further back to older notions, the mother's city's hegemony over the peripheral colonies, the persistence of the colonial, which has been pointed out by post-colonialists, decolonialists, anti-colonialists, etc. They challenge the idea of the break, and that it has been significant enough a rupture to really make this a truly post-colonial era. The notion of the break is either mythical, and we need to ask in the interests of whom, or the end of a particular type of imperial or colonial power. So Chaudhry here, in quite an accessible way, argues that the values of liberalism and capitalism that define our age, the post-colonial zeitgeist, are not the break from the empire that many envisaged, but in fact are continuous with us. I'd like to start with this long excerpt. Sorry, this is an intertextual video. It's an excerpt from an interview with the sociologist Rolando Vasquez, who I mentioned had worked on the Let's Do Diversity report and the Decolonial Summer School in Middelburg. I've included it for those who may think this is a new issue. Rolando goes on to locate decolonial struggles as a Mexican with the modernity of Europe and its increasing notions of itself as superior and dominant, and its desires to dominate. And he uses the terms modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality in his work. I'm going to quote, and you can read further on this more, but I just wanted to quote two bits. Before 1942, there was no project of civilization, but a Europe at the margins of the world. Importantly, the year 1492 set out the conditions in which Europe could hold the power of naming the world and of mapping the world. It's colonization that enables the West and Europe to understand itself as the locus of enunciation, as a place that holds the power of representation. Before that, Europe was a province in a geographically peripheral part of the world that had been looking to the east and south to other civilizations. 1492 marks the moment that enables Europe to understand itself symbolically as the center of the world in both a spatial and an epistemic dimension. The West begins to present itself as the owner of history and to erase other histories either by exclusion or by incorporation. Vasquez eloquently describes decolonial thinking, which is a form of critical consciousness of the interrelatedness of the current realities in the modern world with what has become hidden. Vasquez is thinking both in material and philosophical terms, and he gives an example that I'd like to quote. He says, today, when you go to the supermarket here in the global north and get a chocolate, you are practicing this relation. You cannot have that chocolate these electronics or these clothes without the suffering of others across the planet. This is the modernity coloniality preposition. The consciousness does not come from Western thought or dominant discourses. It emerges from the colonial, from the experience and awareness of coloniality. He says it comes and names the experience of those that have been subjected to the dominance of the West. That there is no modernity without coloniality tells us there is no industrial revolution without the plantation. There is no enlightenment without enslavement. There is no violence without race, etc. So you'll see that in his thought, the relationship and its entanglement with imperial power and notions of the modern are central. This is not about inclusion, accommodation, or a marrying or a desire to be in the center of the Eurocentric power, and he's clear about this. So I'm just going to quote this here. He says, "We do not want to become part of a system that has been built upon the erasure of other worlds, worldlessness, and wasting away of earth or earthlessness. For us, modernity and coloniality are inseparable, and that's why we do not want to be human, if being human means the expression of this anthropocentric and Eurocentric model of civilization. In so doing, you will find in his version of decolonial thinking is an avoidance of grand narratives, of positioning as dominance, and of utopias. Rather, there's an acceptance and listening to suffering, to the material, to justice, and a hope for a return of the erased ancestral. Again, connecting it with how thinking is formed is a central intellectual who contributed early on to the notion of decolonization of my continent and what decolonization would mean for the African university. You'll see in this excerpt from the text, Decolonizing the Mind is a clear association with decolonial gestures of the South American that I alluded to earlier, which differs to much post-colonial thought, which attempts somehow to live within, alongside, and wrestle with power in and of the West. So his thesis highlights a number of issues, and I'd like to talk about these, and of course it's great thanks to Mbembe's paper. So first there's the idea of decentering, that we have to coldly and consciously look at what imperialism has been doing to us and to our view of ourselves in the universe. That's his quote. In Nguyi's terms, the call for Africanization is a project of re-centering. It's about rejecting the assumptions that the modern West is the central root of Africa's consciousness and cultural heritage. And it's about rejecting the notion that Africa is merely an extension of the West. It's not about closing the door to Europe and other traditions. It's about trying to define what the center is. Then there's the importance of language within the university. Also colonialism and its relationship with monolingualism. And then the challenge to geopolitical relations and boundary making that was established by colonial powers. Decolonizing an African university would require a different sort of imagination, a geographical imagination that extends beyond the confines of the nation state. And Mbembe refers to Du Bois here, a text from 1919, Du Bois being the African-American scholar, who spoke about the special relations that center on the destiny of humankind and not one color, race, or ethos. If we're going to ask the question of this institution, it needs to be something that makes sense within this context. And I just have to hold my breath on asking this question, because if the decolonizing the curriculum toolkit or how-to is imported without questioning from England, I think there will be less unease to asking the question. But of course, there's an irony importing it from England. I think the tension when one even begins to broach this issue is palpable, even to a person I guess quite tone deaf to the complexities of the issues of Northern Ireland, as I am often reminded as an outsider. This question opens an explosive can of worms. What is the colonial here? I think perhaps one could begin with the name of our institution. Touching on the question brings out such debate. What is the definition of a colony? How does this relate to the Troubles or to Northern Ireland exceptionism? I guess the question is, what is hidden, evaded, blinkered from vision? What informs the limitations to social and knowledge formation in this space? Again, one needs to look at what is erased. So I'm going to touch on some traces. I've noticed a prevalence of cultural cringe that seems much aligned with what was observed in other places, dogged with the centre-periphery relations, such as Australia. There is also a nostalgia within the British that harkens towards empire. For those with a decolonial thinking awareness, this is disconcerting. How much of that nostalgia is here? How much of this is also specific to here, such as the memorialization of the empire, its losses and battles and allies with the Northern Ireland of old? What about the growth of development studies in Belfast and its roots with Catholic nuns returning from nations as they were decolonized, and how poverty is constructed? Then there's racism and race in Northern Ireland. How complicated is this discussion? Is sectarianism a form of racism? In the obsession with the divisions and the reconciliation, what other racisms are allowed to breed and emerge? Ethnicity, religion, and its hidden relations to the colonial and modern project, definitely something I would think would be important to discuss in Northern Ireland. And what is Northern Ireland in terms of its whiteness? One might also want to look at history, its construction, and its teaching at secondary school, and the strange impositions on what we can and can't do as academics and staff within the university. This might be a sign of the obfuscation within institutions where knowledge is produced and formed, that there isn't so much of an explicit exploration of the complicity and benefits of Northern Ireland in colonial pursuits and processes. And then this is not my area, but there does seem to be a resistance in orienting discussions about colonialism, coloniality, and Northern Ireland. Mostly it seems to be around the post-colonial. It's just an observation, but I think one can safely say that questions around this are not a dominant narrative within the university. Another issue is language. This is a very strong sign to me, and it's a screen print from the Gowns December 19, 2019 article titled A Bilingual University. It shows students identifying that what to them as Irish speakers were social issues emerged as a political issue within the university. Then there are the traces of the erasures of what once was and who and what is. Think of travellers, Irishness, cosmologies, belief systems, places where knowledge and wisdom grew in society and perhaps are still learned from, that are not only vetted, legitimized, or proved via the academy as an institution of authority. And then think of some of the norms within our institutions: competitiveness, lack of comprehension of equity, that is how to practice it, what it requires at macro, meso, and micro levels, a positioning of international students as cash cows and bums on seats, terms that I, for one, only learnt within this institution, and a concern that many of the good agendas and projects, such as widening participation, Athena Swan, the equality movement, diversity, does not display joined-up thinking. And also, whom is really pushing for ensuring that that blinkedness is addressed and that there are active and genuine spaces for challenging such blinkedness? So when asking what is there to decolonize at Queen's, I think we may want to look at the traces and erasures. Traces of submission in the ready appropriation of, for instance, compliance to political correctness and tick boxing, a prevalence for neoliberal logic and colonial assertions, our missions to part of the world, for instance, the assertions we make in our teaching and research about ourselves, the UK and the world, the lack of push around critical development studies within internationalization, and with here, when I'm thinking about internationalization here, I mean in our student recruitment, in our research orientations, in our engagement with the Sustainable Development Goals. A strong sense of cultural hegemony, structural inequalities and exclusions, also the way that we construct equality, diversity and inclusion. Even a bit of empire building, and I've included a text here which I thought was quite an interesting one. Curriculum and the notion of curriculum has been complicit with social engineering, and formal education can be seen as either a positive way to form the adult into what is needed, such as for a productive society, professional academic knowledge, or in a less explicit way, in a more tacit way or hidden way, to demonstrate the norms and values which we inculcate in our citizens, our students, our staff, or more severely legitimize in some more than others. This is the capital that people may bring with them from their families or certain backgrounds, and in that way structural inequalities are reproduced, or that strategic people, students or staff, learn to adopt to pass as one of the valued group and to do well, and in so doing may take on a second skin, for an awkward metaphor, or certain dispositions that are more valued, such as competitiveness, as I referred to earlier, ambition, assertiveness, that are associated with more masculinist neoliberal norms. The curriculum, in a sense, is how we are formed as subjects within our institutions, our disciplines, as community members and citizens of a nation. So critical race theory, for instance, takes on the idea of the university, particularly the settler colonial university, which we can assume we are within, perhaps, as one which is not only complicit but also promotes systemic injustice. There's been much critical writing, particularly in the time of the Anthropomorphine, which is concerned with how we construct whom and what is human, and also the roots of that categorization being firmly within the Western academy. And it's of course linked to how notions of racial purity were linked to others who were seen as not so human, requiring civilization or modernizing, and perhaps one aspect of religion or one leaning in religion to make them more human. In many developing contexts, there have been long-standing patterns of power from colonialism, the Cold War, and related conflicts that continue to define culture, intersubjectivity, social formation, knowledge formation, and its exchange. These asymmetrical power structures are maintained alive in the criteria for academic performance, in the cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern existence. I take this from Maldonado Torres, who sees decoloniality as, and I'll quote, a confrontation with the racial, gender, and sexual hierarchies that were put in place or strengthened by European modernity as it colonized and enslaved populations throughout the planet. I have included the Becker text here, who writes that through processes of subjectification, the subject of higher education could reframe historic ontological othering and actively take part in the processes of becoming and being human in higher education. And then Saad Jahan questions why the spiritual and spirituality remains marginalized in the Western academy. And in fact, more and more there are concerns about this emerging in studies on alienation, academic identity, and the consequences and costs of belonging in the academy on the formation of the full person. I've just highlighted a few, but there are so many scholars who have looked at the question of decolonizing to lay bare, challenge, and dismantle the specificity of colonial subjectification. When it comes to knowledge formation, Heleta traces the roots of Eurocentrism and epistemic violence at universities and argues that opposition to change at that level is entrenched in the university structures. He argues that, and I quote him, the movement to radically transform and decolonize higher education must find ways to hold institutions accountable and maintain the non-violent and intellectual struggle until epistemic violence and Eurocentrism are dismantled. Interestingly, his text was published at the same time as the great Mbembe text. Two non-South African scholars, Mbembe far older than Salvo, within South Africa, the South African context, making sense of the fiery beginnings of an intellectual revolt, which has led us to this discussion on this video. Soon after the beginnings, you would get the reaction to this understanding as expressed by him. There are many others. Within her account is horror at the possibility of dismantling knowledge systems centralized within the Western Academy, an association with all that is feared in post-positivistic times. She refers to irrationality, witchcraft, bad knowledge, bad politics, and asserts the importance of disciplinary knowledge as legitimate. There is no doubt that this is a fiery space of debate, decolonizing, and perhaps most particularly because academic identity is often wedded to our disciplines, to which we are loyal. In Decolonizing the Universities, the Politics of Knowledge, are various explorations of decolonizing universities and the various legitimations, delegitimations around knowledge, the curriculum and knowledge systems, power and the geopolitical, within the contributions of various actors in higher education studies in the country, trying to tackle decolonization at that level. It's open access, so I have a link, have a look. And I think open access is a really important practice of the project of decolonization. And then to end this on knowledge formation is a related but different attack by Sajahan and Wagner, whose close reading of the impact of metrics in scholarly publications reveal that, and please note this is the context of Canadian higher education, that metrics are caught up in colonial logics. And now remember, it's the metrics of impact, despite the rhetoric of benevolence and public good. Certainly, similar concerns have been expressed about how knowledge is produced of and for the SDGs, open access, and the common good. Undoubtedly, decolonization is not only about the imposition of power and dominance and mythologies at institutional and disciplinary levels, but also how they inform larger signifiers and external reference. There are questions about in what ways colonial logic is morphed in and through global capital and large normative frameworks. Many questions have been raised about the relationship, for instance, between development and higher education. This decolonial analysis by Shajan of global higher education looked at policy reports, performance indicators, and technical assistance of the OECD and World Bank, and suggests, according to him, that standardized international organizational policy and processes actually reproduce global inequalities. And they do this through enacting, and he calls it a God-eye point of view, colonial difference, and the geopolitics of knowledge. Our institutions are formed and shaped in relation to these systems, their related measurements, and further their agendas. If there is one lesson we can learn from colonialism, surely this is it. This is a cover of a colloquium I coordinated with my collaborator Dr. Nandita Dawan from Jadavpur University. We asked questions about the presumption that higher education should drive the Sustainable Development Goals, when higher education is itself not fit for purpose and requires substantial transformation if it is to practice the ideas of equality, equity, and democratic participation processes of just institutions. Closer to our bodies as academics is the meso-curriculum of how we are formed and the conditions for participation within the academy. Is the university a colonial power? Are we its subjects? Is it a corporation? A democracy? What are the bounds of citizenship within and the politics of participation? Most of my research of late is focused on this question in South Africa, in India, and in collaboration with academics from other contexts grappling actively with academic agency and governance in the academy. Way before decolonization became a buzzword, there was the powerful text of Spivak's questioning how are academics schooled, and obviously schooled in this sense is to be made docile within professional socialization models. And she asks how we can gain consciousness. One active area of scholarship in this regard is academic development. That is how academics are developed, the hidden curriculum also, of what is made to make them focus on, be obfuscated by, whose interests they or we serve, etc. I've included a text by Waderick and Uwit Bauer who look at how academic development as an applied practice within higher education institutions is not neutral, but which needs to be critically reflexive about its project. When I was in such a role in a South African institution that ran courses to trouble notions of power and academic responsibility for transforming the microcurriculum, I also wrote on the possibilities I saw, and I have one paper here that I've cited for you. Then if we extend this issue to institutional culture and neoliberalism, I found this paper by Rawlings one which is really compelling. It uses metaphors of academics as displaced by the colonization of market forces. And then Shahajan again offers hope of resilience in his paper. He writes, and I'd like to quote him, "Various scholars have suggested ways to resist neoliberal conditions in higher education. In analyzing current neoliberal policies and practices in higher education, I suggest that post-colonial theories of resistance can enhance our ability as academics and administrators to understand and resist these policies and practices. He argues that we need to place emphasis on transformational resistance, or the creation of new ways of being, knowing, and doing in higher education in order to transform the academy." One such initiative is the Counter Narratives of Higher Education project. Have a look sometime at these videos, which were created from academics' narratives, which enable engagement with identity, responsibility, and situatedness, and which we hope will provide generative solutions. Again, click on this as it's hyperlinked, and you'll find the resource may be of interest either for your own thinking or for your teaching and creation of similar counter spaces. Another is the Higher Education Arts Archive, where I have curated texts which explore counter stories of higher education. This emerged from my realization of the power of the figurative and the affect to help us to connect and to express. This really came from my belief in the arts and non-dispassionate research, which Gloria Wicker so beautifully describes here. And this too is from a book which we have an e-copy of in our library. In the spirit, and more explicitly to do with the decolonial and the wider decoloniality in the university, is this fantastic new website. Have a look at it. I'll end with a return to what you will probably do within the workshop you'll be going to. That's looking at the relationship between content and form, between our ideas and our practice, and questioning what decolonization may mean to you and your students. For me, a central concern is that we focus on how what we do operates, both for our own current students, and that will require active engagement with them, but also more largely, as I've intimated, because benevolence is not enough. I collected a few texts here, not as representative of what to do, but rather to say we should seek and learn from many spaces across the world on this. There's the Garbutt text about modern Australia and how it was defined as an immigrant nation, a settler society that is located in the south, and yet is problematically, ontologically, and epistemologically oriented towards the north. In the text, they talk about how the experience and trauma of the colonial, far from being resolved, is actually characterized by a condition of collective amnesia, which is expressed in social, cultural, and psychological boundaries. So have a look at that. They really come from a perspective of the borderlands, and I think it would really be interesting to have a look at that and how pedagogy can become unruly and unsettling in a productive way. The Jones paper offers insights into what can be learnt between colleagues. They use little stories to map the hidden histories of place and to contest notions of the certainty of knowledge in the practice, research, and work they do as educators. And then there's the Lotsitsika paper, which may be dated, but I think is really of interest to those concerned about ecological thinking. And it situates decolonization within 4 streams of emerging, transformative, transgressive learning, research, and praxis in higher education. Rissager looks at decolonization and language. A really interesting take for us as we internationalize. She takes into consideration that there are more than 50 different languages present at most universities, and approaching the problem of how one analyzes the practice of the hierarchization of language, the inclusion and exclusion of language. It's a really interesting thing to do on a university campus. And then I'll end with this text, the Young text. It's an edited volume, which I think I've ordered it for the library. It's definitely coming. It's definitely in the library. It brings decolonial and feminist thoughts into proximity as powerful traditions of critical pedagogy. And they're often 4 foci. The one is reflections on the politics of knowledge. The second is what they describe as the challenging pathways of finding your voice. Then thirdly, the constraints and possibilities of institutional contexts. And lastly, the relationship between decolonial and feminist thoughts and established academic disciplines. What's quite cool about it is they've interspersed manifestos throughout the book, which are formulated by activists from across the world. So thank you for this opportunity to, listen and think through what I think this is all about, and especially to Laura, Tracy, and to Hamza. So this recording has been made with the contextual framing of this workshop. Of course, it's incomplete and will be insufficient for your processes. However, I hope it has been of value for your engagement. Thank you.